Good morning. I'm Steve Parrish. I'm professor of Old Testament at Memphis Theological Seminary. I am in my 28th year there now, so I've been there a long time. It's good to be here. Eileen had contacted me earlier about coming and spending a couple of Sundays with you as you wade through this rather large and complicated book that we call the Bible. And so it's good to be a part of that little segment along the way. And so I bear you greetings from the seminary and the folks there. I've done some speaking around. I was speaking at Idlewild earlier this past fall, and I discovered after I got there that my colleague Mitzi Miner was going to be coming along a few weeks after I was there. And so I was looking at the website for Calvary Church yesterday evening, and I happened to notice that in a few weeks, Pete Gathke and Mitzi Miner will be coming along here too. So I'm beginning to feel sort of like a minor John the Baptist who comes along and prepares the way for others coming along after me. So, but that's okay. I'm glad to be able to do that. I understand that my task is to and I'd rather have a conversation with you rather than so much as just stand up here and speak to you. I find that if I'm in a congregation or a group of people to be a little more interesting as a rule than just sitting and listening. So I'm going to proceed along that way. I understand that we're dealing with this morning a section pertaining to the prophets, and particularly the prophets of Elijah and Elisha. And depending on how time runs, then we might move into prophets that come about a century later and say a little bit or spend a little time with Hosea and Amos. But the way things usually work out, we don't get that far along the road. So we'll go as far as we can and see where that is. The prophets are a complicated group of people to understand and to get to know in many ways. We begin to encounter prophets in the biblical story along about the same time that we begin to encounter kings. That's a peculiar social arrangement that is not fully understood by people who do study the prophets and the kings, but we do find that they arrive about the same time. And the interesting thing is, too, that they tend to fizzle out about the same time. That is, after the demise of the monarchy due to the Babylonians around the 587 time frame, we began to see no more of the prophets of the sort that we'd seen with prophets like Elijah or Amos or Isaiah or Jeremiah and so on. And so it seems then that prophets and kings arise about the same time and they disappear about the same time, which is sort of an interesting relationship. In some cases, the prophets supported kings, or that is, they had encouraging and positive words to say to them. Elisha is one such character. Not totally, but he did have a certain role to play in supporting some of the king's battles with the Arameans. Other prophets like Isaiah also had this kind of two-focused role. They would be supportive at times, but more often than not, prophets were critical of kings. They saw things that were largely going wrong with the society, the way that the kings ruled and operated. And so prophets often then were disruptors, if you will. Kings, on the other hand, were those individuals who preferred things to be stabilized and orderly. And as a result of that, they upheld the status quo, and often that was at all costs. And some of those costs were considerable to the populations over which the kings ruled. In fact, as I said, they have been called or considered disruptors. One of the books that we use at the seminary speaks of Elijah as a disruption. His story appears in the book of 1 Kings, chapter 17. I was sort of joking. Nobody, pulls out the Bible. They don't at the seminary anymore either. They pull out a cell phone and look at that. So it's kind of hard to tell if they're up to, something they shouldn't be doing with their phone or reading the Bible they have there. But with 1 Kings 17, and I'm not going to read through the whole stories with you, but I'll set some background and try to say some of the things that I think are important to be said to understand these prophets. As I say, one of the books that we use has been co-written by Walter Brueggemann and Terry Fretheim and a couple of other guys, has said that Elijah is a disruption. If you look at the text that come just before we meet Elijah in 1 Kings 17, you'll see what has happened is, by this point in time, the united monarchy that prevailed during the time of David and the time of Solomon has fallen apart. And so by around 922, before the Common Era, we speak of a divided monarchy. Strictly speaking, Israel is the name of the people in the north, and then Judah the name of the southerners to the south. And that situation prevails from that point on. There's never really a fully restored political unity named Israel. So you have those divided kingdoms until they, one by one, begin to fall to the imperial forces of that particular day. So about 922 then, you have this division of the north from the south. And when you look at the book of Kings, you'll see that that way it is shaped mirrors that division. You enter into it with the transition from David to Solomon, and a number of chapters at the beginning that deal with Solomon. And so after you find, after Solomon disappears from the scene, to put it nicely, after Solomon dies, then you have the historian chronicling the two kingdoms. And so you'll have a snippet of this book of Kings that deals with the king in the south, and then you'll switch over to the king in the north, and the king in the south, and the king in the north, and so it goes through the book of Kings. And so we have that nice little schematic, orderly presentation going on up to chapter 16, through part of chapter 16 in the book of 1 Kings. Suddenly, Elijah breaks in on the scene in chapter 17. And so this book that I've referred to says he was a disruption. And indeed, he does disrupt the orderly flow, the orderly presentation of events in the book of Kings itself. But I might say that Elijah, if you want to call him a disruption, would say there's been a previous disruption. And that disruption lies with the king Ahab. And so it's important to know just a little bit about what he has done that ushers into the scene or onto the scene this character of Elijah. At the end of 1 Kings 16, you find this line, if I can focus in on it here. As if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who was the first king of the northern kingdom. He's famous or infamous for establishing worship sites in the north and the south and featuring in those golden bulls. And so all of the northern kings are viewed in light of that particular act on the part of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. So it's not enough for him to do that. It goes on to say, he took as his wife Jezebel, daughter of the king Eshbaal of the Sidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. He erected an altar for Baal on the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria. He also made a sacred pole, another cultic object that was a part of Canaanite worship. Ahab did more to provoke the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than had all the kings of Israel who were before him. In his days, Hillel of Bethel built Jericho, and he laid the foundation at the cost of his sons. And it goes on to talk a bit about that. So what we have is the introduction of elements of Canaanite religion, particularly Baalism, that are advocated and supported by Ahab, the king of Israel. The time frame we're talking about all of this is around the 850s or so, a little earlier than 850s, to give you a chronological anchor to hold in mind. So he's introduced very blatantly elements of Canaanite worship, and that is Baalism. And onto the scene then comes Elijah. And that's where we pick up the story. And so if Elijah is a disruptor, Elijah probably viewed Ahab as a disruptor of faithful Yahwistic or faithful Israelite religion. What we have in this opening of the chapter is Elijah who breaks onto the scene, and he issues this word of the Lord to the king of the north, Ahab. And he says there's going to be no rain for 3 years. And that indeed begins to pan out. Now what's interesting to know or to think about here is the nature of the gods that we're talking about here. Israel's God and the god of the Canaanites, Baal. Just a query, do you happen to know what Baal's specialty was in terms of being the god of the Canaanites? It's rain. It's producing rain. Baal is the fertility-oriented god. That is, the one who controls the thunderstorms and sends the rain. And as a result of the rain, the grass grows and the sheep and the cattle eat. And then they have small sheep and small cattle, and so on the cycle goes. So fertility-oriented God. And so you have Elijah breaking onto the scene here and saying, it's going to be a drought, and it's not going to be caused by Baal. Yahweh, our God, is going to cause the rain to stop. And at that point, Elijah is instructed to go and flee to a particular place, and water and food will be provided. And what's interesting is how this pans out. He goes to a brook of Cherith, which is on the eastern side of the Jordan River, the text tells us. And while he's there, he's got this wadi, or this small little stream, if you will, that provides water. And it says that the ravens bring him food to eat. And so he's fed and sustained there in the land. Remember, Baal is not doing this. This is Israel's God who's doing the feeding and the sustaining with the water until the water supply runs out. Sort of the nature of these little gulches in Israel in the spring of the year, the early part of the year, right following the rains that have come through the winter and early spring. You have water rushing through these kinds of gorges, but as the sun continues to shine and the days grow longer and hotter, eventually the supply of water dries up, and that's what happens here. Another interesting thing about this, I don't know exactly what to make of this yet, but in the listing of unclean animals in the book of Leviticus, ravens are one of those creatures that's unclean. And so there's a sense in which God is even using that which is deemed unclean to bring food to the prophet. Sort of an interesting sort of feature of the story. When that water runs out, he is instructed to go to someplace else, that is to Zarephath, which is in Sidon, or near Sidon. Now remember, Jezebel was a non-Israelite. She was a Sidonian, and this is her home territory, and it's actually the headquarters of Baal worship. And so Elijah is sent now to that territory for provision. Now the way that provision plays out is sort of odd. The women here, I think, can appreciate this. Elijah goes, and there's a widow at Zarephath, and she's out gathering sticks. And she has this son, and she doesn't have much to eat. And Elijah comes on the scene and sees her, and he says, "Bring me a little water in a vessel so that I may drink." And so as she was going in, he called behind her and says, "Bring me a morsel of bread in your hand." And so, in other words, go to the kitchen and fix me something to eat. It's essentially what it is. And she relays then that she doesn't have food. What she has actually is sufficient only for her and her son to eat. And then after they've had enough to eat, they're going to sit down and die. And Elijah says not to worry, that as long as the drought exists, you'll have food and you'll have water to sustain you. And indeed, that's the way it works. And so you sense what's going on here. This is another gift of life granted by Israel's God, not in Israel, but in the heart of Baalism, up there in the Phoenician territory, home of Jezebel. And one of the things that we are told about Jezebel is that she has these 450 prophets who eat at her table, that is, who are on pretty much the king's payroll. And so here in this area, in this territory, you have this divine provision and sustaining of life by Israel's God. So a nice little twist of irony going on there, it seems. This goes on for a little while, and then suddenly and inexplicably, the widow's son is stricken, it appears dead. And her reaction is this. She says to Elijah, "What have you against me, O man of God? You have come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to cause the death of my son." Sort of an odd thing. It's as if she suspects that Elijah, this holy man of God, has come into her presence, and God has gotten too close and discovered some sort of secret sin or a secret fault in the woman and the son that results in the son's death. Elijah says that's not so, and so he then offers a prayer, and then there is a bit of a ritual that goes here. He stretches himself upon the child 3 times and cries out, "O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again." And it's not just simply the prayer that's acting here, but there's liturgical, if you will, or ritual involved in that. I figure Episcopalians can resonate with that, with rituals and all. I mean, they're important, they matter, and so there's a theological basis for those in the biblical text itself, as you might suspect. Another act of giving life in this land of Phoenicia that is supposed to be under control of the life-giving God who isn't doing very much in the story. The 18th chapter is probably the one that we know best. And let me just pause for a second and see if you have any reaction to this. The 18th chapter is probably one that we know best, and I do want to talk about that. Eileen said I need to wrap this up at close to 12 as possible, so I'm going to keep an eye on that. Martin's here. He'll tell you that sometimes I forget the clock. So if I do, remind me. I won't be bothered by that. But any kind of reaction to this? Don't you think it's kind of neat the way this pans out, that you have the one who's supposed to be the giver of life, Baal, who seems to be insufficient, impotent, if you will, in this particular case. And you have Yahweh here, who is acting in this foreign land, in this God's territory, as the one who's actually giving life and providing food, providing water, and as you might think ahead in the story, does indeed, in this next chapter, cause rain to come. To ponder that, that's a neat thing. The 18th chapter, the way that gets going is this. You have a servant of the king's house. His name is Obadiah, not to be confused with the prophet Obadiah, who has that big, massive book in the Old Testament. That one chapter, that one chapter book. It's sort of the Old Testament version of Philemon in the New. It's sort of a small little book. And not to be confused with that prophet, it's a servant. And we're told that this servant has been hiding now because Jezebel, the Phoenician queen, married to Ahab, the Israelite king, she has been persecuting the prophets and having some of them executed. And so Obadiah has taken 50 and hidden them one place and 50 more and hidden them in the other place, and is providing food at quite a risk. Obadiah recognizes Elijah for whom he is as a genuine prophet, acknowledges that. Elijah says, "I want you to go to the king, tell him I have a message for him." And Obadiah doesn't really want to do that, as you might suspect, because the king would not react favorably to having heard that he was in contact with Elijah. And besides, he was afraid that when he did Elijah's bidding and told the king where he was and that he wanted to meet with King Ahab, that the prophet, being the prophet who's here one day and gone the next, that he would leave and the king would be angry at Obadiah, and it'd be one of those, kill the messenger kinds of situations, quite literally. Eventually he prevails and he goes and gives a message to the king, and that sets up a meeting between the prophet Elijah and the king Ahab. And what results from this is that you have Elijah, who is granted permission to gather all of the prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel, and he will go, and the idea is that they will build altars, and they're going to put the sacrifice on the altar, and they'll pray to their God, and the God who is able to start the sacrifice will be the God who brings an end to the drought. And so the prophets of Baal get to go first. And we're told that they go through all these kinds of contortions in an effort to bring rain or to get the fire to consume the sacrifice, marching around the altar and even to the point of slicing themselves as a way of trying to induce their God to light the sacrifice. An interesting line here, you might think. Elijah at one point kind of mocks what they're doing, and he says, "Cry aloud. Surely he is a god. Either he is meditating, or he has wandered away, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and must be awakened." So, cry aloud. This line, this expression, has wandered away, sometimes is translated as turned aside. It actually is a euphemistic expression in the Hebrew. There's a lot of those euphemisms that you would miss, which means perhaps he's gone to the potty. He's relieving himself, essentially. And so, this would not be something that the prophets of Baal probably would have taken, as a favorable remark. But all of that to no avail. And then Elijah has his turn. And again, we see another ritual actually going on here that's sort of interesting. He takes 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of Israel, and with those stones he builds an altar in the name of the Lord, and then he makes a trench around it. And then he has water brought, a considerable amount of water brought, poured over the altar into the trench, and then again he's done, this is all after he's got the wood laid out on the altar, has this done again, and has it done a third time, sort of 3 times of doing that. And then he's about to offer his prayer. It's an interesting kind of thing. Leads one to wonder, what's going on with this water business? For one, you kind of wonder, where's he getting all this water in a time of drought? You'd think water would be kind of scarce and a precious commodity. So that's always in play there. The other thing is that might say, though, it's a valuable thing that's being poured out. We know that the fire is lit, and so certainly another effect of that is that it makes all the more kind of miraculous, if you will, the lighting of the altar following the prayer. When God is able to do that, lighting wet wood is not an easy thing to do. Martin will have heard this too here, but I tell this when I come to this story in one of my classes. And back in the days when I was in graduate school, and even before that when I was pastoring in a parish, didn't have a lot of money, and so vacation time came around. What our family and I would do, we'd go camping, tent camping, real camping, not pulling up in a park with one of these big RVs with a barky little dog and things like that. This is tent camping. And so we would do that, and when our daughters began to come along, we did that with them, although we fizzled out pretty much after the second daughter pretty quickly of camping. But we went to Cedars of Lebanon State Park over in Middle Tennessee one time, and it rained all week. That also contributed to the camping fizzling out. But it rained all week, and so pretty much spent most of our days sitting around under the canopy that we had stretched over the picnic table outside the tent. And one of the days, it got dry enough that we were able to go out on little excursions and wander around trails and things, and we did. And got back, and it was after dark, but on the way back it had started raining again. And I had not I had not stacked up and covered my firewood, and so it was wet. And all of the other people had their fires going, and it was dark, and so, in an effort to get ours going too, I got a trusty can of Coleman camp fuel, if you remember that, and douse it with that, and douse it some more, and ritually I did it a third time, and then I stepped back and light a match and throw it, and it goes, a 30-foot pillar of fire shoots straight up in the sky, and eyes around the other campfires were this large, wondering, with a pillar of fire that led the Israelites through the wilderness had suddenly showed up in the campground. And so it heightens the, it's not easy to light wet wood, and Israel's God, Yahweh, was able to do that without the assistance of Coleman camp fuel. It lights it, and it consumes it, and the result of that is, very shortly thereafter, the gift of rain begins to come. Another example then here in this story of this contest between, or conflict between the prophets of Baal and Israel's God. What they're supposed to be good at doing and what their God is supposed to be good at doing, God is incapable of doing it at all, and it is Israel's God who does that. So I have 12 o'clock straight up, and so some of you may want to beat the Methodists to the restaurants or something, and time to go. I'll be back next week and spend a little time with you. Eileen has given me an assignment to consider. I understand that you all are reading along, or some of you are reading along in a book, the story. Yeah. So I'm going to follow the assignment that features text that you will have looked at by next Sunday if we do that. But anyway, thank you for being here, and it's good to see you all, and I hope you have a great remainder of the Sunday afternoon and a good week coming up, and hope to see you next week. Shalom.